Welcome back, everyone, to the final section of our symposium. We have two more talks forthcoming, and then we're going to have an open panel discussion again. Our next speakers are Marino, Cardelli, and Steve Sheldon from Cotswold Archaeology. Marino has been working as an archaeologist for over 18 years. He initially started out in Italy, and then he moved to Cotswold Archaeology in 2015. He's done a huge number of really important sites in Gloucester. He's also worked in Bath and in medieval Redcliffe in Bristol. He's a very experienced archaeologist. Steve Sheldon has also been working in archaeology for certainly over 18 years. He started out at Colchester Archaeological Trust before moving to Cotswold Archaeology, and he has done a huge amount of work in the city in recent years. They're going to be speaking about archaeological works at King's Quarter in Gloucester, which are some very recent ongoing works, and I think really interesting.
Hello, and thanks for joining us. My name's Steve Sheldon, a project manager at Cotswold Archaeology, and today I'm going to provide some background information and briefly summarise the results of previous archaeological investigations undertaken at the King's Quarter site in Gloucester, before handing over to my colleague Marino Cardelli, who's been leading the latest phase of archaeological works on the site. The focus of our presentation today will be plots 2 and 4 of the King's Quarter redevelopment, as shown on the current slide. These plots were previously occupied by both the Bruton Way multi-storey car park and the former bus station. They also form part of a larger area that is currently undergoing extensive mixed-use redevelopment, including both King's Square and the wider King's Quarter development itself. The current site lies beyond the limits of the Roman fortifications of the city of Gloucester, which lie to the immediate southwest of the site, as shown on the current slide by the yellow and blue lines, which represent the line of the former Roman city wall and its associated ditch respectively. However, Roman structures have also been identified immediately to the northwest of Market Parade during excavations undertaken during the 1970s. These structures are considered to represent the continuation of a previously identified area of extramural settlement, as shown in purple on the current slide, that fronted out onto Northgate Street, the site of a former Roman road. By the 13th century, the River Twyver, which may have been initially canalised during the Roman period to feed into the outer ditch of the city's defences, is thought to have been diverted along the lines of Market Parade and Station Road, with the area to the southeast of Market Parade, shown by the dashed yellow line on the current slide, believed to have become the precinct of the White Friars following the establishment of a Carmelite Friary in circa 1268. Until the most recent phase of archaeological works, little direct archaeological evidence for the extent or layout of the Friary complex was available. However, a watching brief undertaken in 1974 at 10 and 11 Market Parade, as highlighted by the yellow circle, identified a medieval tiled floor, into which a human burial was replaced, along with a number of robbed out walls which were interpreted as being the western corner of a church of the Carmelite Friars. The majority of the White Friars complex is believed to have been largely demolished following the dissolution of the monasteries. However, the location of the White Friars Chapel is still shown on Speed's map of 1610, as highlighted in yellow on the current slide. A further substantial building, originally known as the Founders' Lodging and later the Friars' Barn, appears to have survived later and was seemingly incorporated into the parliamentarian defences of Gloucester, which ran through the western parts of the current site during the English Civil War. We'll now turn to some of the more recent investigations that have been undertaken on the site. These include an evaluation undertaken in 2014 by Cotswold Archaeology, which was undertaken to provide baseline archaeological data for the wider development area. Of particular relevance to the current site are trenches C and D, which were both excavated within the location of the former bus station and are now highlighted in yellow on the current slide. Some, albeit limited, evidence of Roman activity was identified in Trench C, excavated as part of this evaluation, where a beam slot, shown in orange on the current slide, and associated surfaces, shown in yellow on the current slide, were revealed at a depth of just below 2 meters below current ground level. And here we see a photograph of the beam slot and associated surfaces, just shown on the previous slide. These remains suggest that a wooden building once stood in the location of this trench, close to the previously identified buildings associated with the Roman suburb to the north of Market Parade. The exact date of this building remains uncertain, although it may relate to the earlier Roman period based upon its wooden construction, or to a later 4th century phase of activity, as some evidence for a movement back to wooden buildings within the walled circuit of Gloucester has previously been identified. Unfortunately, no structural evidence for the former White Friars complex or for its associated burial ground was identified during this phase of evaluation. However, probable cultivation soils, some of which contain pottery of 13th to 14th century date, were revealed in both this trench and Trench D excavated to the southeast, and they may reflect landscaping or gardening activities associated with the religious institution. In 2019, Oxford Archaeology carried out further evaluation works, and a total of 5 trenches were excavated in the current site itself during this phase of evaluation. 2 of these trenches, Trench 4 and 6, identified a series of probable Roman deposits suggestive of a wet environment, which gradually dried out over time. These deposits were overlain by a number of layers, seemingly indicative of gradually accumulated waste and demolition material. However, no structural remains of Roman date were identified during this phase of works. Equally, no further evidence of structures which could be confidently attributed to the White Friars complex were identified in the OA trenches. Although a human burial, possibly associated with the Friary cemetery, was identified in Trench 4. Overall, the results of the OA evaluation suggest that much of the area investigated, which presumably lay within the Friary precinct, may have been open and used for a variety of purposes, which may have included animal stockades, horticultural activity, or the disposal of rubbish and the production of middens. In 2020, CA were commissioned to undertake further evaluation trenching in the northern part of the site, as now circled in yellow on the current slide. These trenches were excavated to test the location of a new building and to accommodate the relocation of a culverted stretch of the River Twyver. And I'm very pleased to say that we not only found further evidence of Roman activity, but some more substantial evidence pertaining to the White Friars complex itself. This evidence included a number of structural features considered to be of medieval or early post-medieval date, which were identified at depths between 1.3 and 1.75 meters below present ground level. The remains comprise surfaces, walls, and a stone-lined drain, and may represent part of the precinct of the Caramelite Friary established in 1268. However, the precise function of the structural remains identified during this phase of evaluation was unclear given the limited scope of works and a lack of conclusive evidence for the possible layout of the Friary precinct. We did, however, identify a single fragment of disarticulated bone within a later 17th to 18th century deposit identified within a trench excavated as part of this evaluation, and this may provide further evidence for the presence of a cemetery associated with the White Friars complex, although this suggestion at present is somewhat tenuous. And here we see a slightly more interesting image of some of the structures identified during this phase of evaluation. These include a floor just to the left of my colleague Gary on this slide, part of a stone-lined drain just in front of the clipboard, and the area that Gary's currently crouching in represents a large robber trench taking out part of a former medieval wall in this location. And the current image on your screens show part of a possible stone buttress identified in one of our other trenches excavated during this evaluation. And if you look closely on the left of your screen, highlighted in yellow, you can see part of an elaborate piece of worked stone reused within this possible buttress. And it's at this point that I'll now hand over to my colleague Marino to tell you more about this stone in particular and run us through the results of the latest phase of archaeological works.
And that decorated stone was actually bigger than we have anticipated. A beautiful base of a parastal with engraved masons and assembly marks, as you can see here. Most likely a repurposed stonework from a former chapel which was 13th century in date, and it was replaced by a wider church in the 14th. Hi, my name is Marino Cardelli and I'm a project officer for Cotswold Archaeology. For the past 10 months, I've been the leading archaeologist at King's Quarter, and I've been extremely lucky to have seen amazing discoveries on this site, which I'm about to present. As mentioned by Steve, the general objectives of the archaeological excavation were to identify, investigate, and record any significant archaeological deposits or features at the site prior to their destruction by the proposed development. And so in May 2021, archaeological works were initially focused on an excavation of a trench for a new culvert, which is now up and running. The culvert trench was almost 100 meters long, 2.5 meters wide, and approximately 2.3 meters deep. Now I'm going to briefly walk you through the Roman and medieval periods of King's Quarter, based on spot days mainly and on the stratigraphic relationships between the features, although it is anticipated that this phasing scheme may be revised following some more detailed analysis. Let's take a look at the Roman period. All finds we had from site were dating the Roman occupation period from the late 1st century to the 4th century. The natural substrate identified across site included orange or yellow sands and clay, and this was sealed by a 20 plus centimeters thick alluvial deposits, perhaps the result of high intensity flooding activity from the river Tiber. Above the alluvial deposits, we were able to identify the first Roman occupation horizons, consisting of possible cultivation soils, which were truncated by a number of small ditches marking field systems or possible field boundaries to the northwest. Post holes alignments and beam slots were also identified in the northwest end, indicating again, as mentioned by Steve, possible timber frame buildings in the area, the possible sequence of which was recreated on paper by my colleague Nathan. A very intense pitting activity was also observed in the central part and in the southeast corner of the site. The artifacts, mostly domestic waste, recovered from this feature were dating from the late 1st century to the 2nd century. And from the backfill of one of the many large circular pits, which was initially interpreted as a possible well, a pipe clay figurine of the Roman goddess Venus was recovered by my colleague Danny. Dating from the 1st or 2nd century, the statuette is just 17 centimeters high, but in very good conditions. The Venus statuette was possibly crafted in central France, and as the goddess of love and sexuality, this Venus would likely have been used in daily religious observances and possibly stood in a Roman household shrine. The second period also marks a phase of intense activity, both agricultural and domestic, suggesting that this was a very busy extramural area. Here we can see a 8-meter long stretch of an east-west aligned road surface and associated flanking ditches identified in the northwest area, with 2 post pads right at the base of the ditch, which were probably associated with the construction phase of the road. On site, we were under the impression that the road, which remained in use and probably maintained until the 3rd century, could have been leading towards to, and if so, possibly serving a building located to the southeast, of which a 10 meters long wall was exposed. The walls of the building, which is currently under analysis, were surrounded by external stone surfaces, probably courtyards, as you can see here, and large quantity of decorated wall plaster, which was recovered from the backfill of the rubber trenches, may suggest that this may have been a high-status building. In the third period, during the 4th century, the road and the building are no longer in use, but we can see an intense robbery and subsequent levelling activity, suggesting that the area was probably returning to its original function, which was agricultural, and it remained as such until the medieval period. The same events, the same stratigraphy, was also observed in King Square during the past excavations. Let's take a look now at the medieval finds at King's Quarter. The White Friars Caramelite Friary was active in Gloucester from 1268 until 1538. And as mentioned before, in 2020 we have found very large walls in our evaluation trenches, which probably represents the northern side of a religious building, most likely a church. The east-west aligned wall footings exposed during the recent archaeological works at King's Quarter were substantial, and linear walls consisting of roughly squared off facing limestone and rubble core of smaller unworked stone fragments in mortar. The structure incorporated at least 3 arches. These were built over a humped deposit of clay soil, so that the arches were not open. An interesting construction technique, most likely implemented to avoid sinking and distortion of the masonry and to keep it away from groundwater. The stones forming the bases or piers between the arches were extremely large inside. The walls with external buttresses are probably the southern side of the church, which is, as we said earlier, aligned east-west as typical of religious buildings. And to corroborate this theory, a stone coffin containing 2 burials has been found at an equal distance between these 2 walls. The coffins seem to have been set below a floor surface which no longer survives. This appears to be a higher status area of burial, possibly for senior friars, priors, or benefactors, which could mean this particular coffin is in the chancel of the church, so near the altar. Other burials were found further west, which seem to be buried beneath the name and around the external perimeter of the church. The probable floor surface of the church is largely gone, but as well as evidence of walls to the south of the church, we have found a beautiful in situ tiled floor, which may form part of the cloister in the southern range. Both the church wall and the cloister wall were rubbed out, but we can observe a really nice example of polychrome tiled floor on which the Carmelite probably used to walk and pray. You can't help but notice the presence of a concrete pile and its impact right in the middle of the floor. This and many other piles revealed during the excavation were the foundation of the former multi-story car park at King's Quarter. I will spare you my comments on these modern intrusions, but maybe this picture can literally lay the foundations for future discussions regarding civil engineering and its impact on archaeology. White Friars was one of several important religious houses in medieval Gloucester, along with the Black Friars and the Grey Friars. But because of the lack of identifiable remains, the exact location has tended to be overlooked. And this, on the right, is another excellent attempt of reconstruction of the monastery performed by my colleague Nathan. With this last slide, I'm going to conclude my presentation by saying that it was a great pleasure for me to be able to work on such an amazing site. It was hard but satisfying at the same time, and I'd like to thank my team and Steve at Cotswold Archaeology for doing a sterling job despite site conditions. Steve and I are looking forward to the next phase of excavation, which is probably happening as we speak. Thank you all, and I'll see you soon.
Fantastic. And Marino's right. The next phase of work on that side is now proceeding. I met up with him on Friday, actually, and had a chat about how things were going. A really important and interesting site. And Marino and Steve aren't available today to answer questions about that one, but I will be on the panel later if you wish to discuss it.